She was 24 when Elliot Shaw filed the notice. It was not a conversation. It was not a tearful goodbye or a slammed door. It was a formal, legally binding document delivered by a courier while she was 3 days into a river survey, hip-deep in the cold, fast-flowing waters of the Upper Severn. When she returned to their shared flat in Birmingham, exhausted and smelling of river mud and rain, her key no longer worked. On the doorstep, neatly arranged like a museum exhibit of a life dismantled, sat her professional equipment: the tripod, the case for the acoustic Doppler current profiler, her waterproof data logs, and her worn field bag. Taped to the bag was a solicitor's letter, crisp and white and utterly impersonal. It informed her she had been served notice to quit. He had been methodical. He took the money from their joint account, every last pound and penny, leaving a balance of 0. He took the Danish mid-century furniture they had spent months choosing. He took the abstract paintings they had bought at a gallery opening. He took the books, the rugs, the television, the life they had curated with such careful, aesthetic precision. He took everything that had a line item on a spreadsheet, a receipt in a file, a quantifiable, documented value. He had conducted the end of their relationship like a hostile asset seizure, efficient and bloodless. And in his thorough, transactional accounting of their shared existence, he forgot one thing. He forgot the old lock-keeper's cottage her grandmother had left her. He forgot it because he had never known about it. She had never told him, not after that one afternoon when he had looked at a picture of a similar canal-side ruin and declared that the only value in such places was in the land you got after you demolished the old stone and built something new, something clean, something profitable. She had grown up understanding the slow, steady pull of canal water, the way some children grow up understanding silence in a library. It was a foundational language, a deep, quiet grammar that shaped her world. For Cora, the waterways of Worcestershire were not just geographical features. They were ancestral memory, a living archive of her family's story. The specific quality of light on the water at dawn, the hollow knock of a balance beam settling into place, the gurgling sigh of a sluice gate opening. These were the sounds and sights of her childhood, more familiar to her than any nursery rhyme. Her understanding of hydrology was not merely academic, it was cellular, a knowledge passed down not through textbooks, but through osmosis, through long summer days spent by the side of the loch with her grandmother, Rose. Rose Finch was the keeper of that world, the quiet matriarch who seemed less to live beside the canal than to be a part of its ecosystem, as rooted and resilient as the old willows that trailed their branches in the slow-moving water. Her grandmother's history was etched into the very stones of the cottage. Rose had come there as a young bride, married to a man whose life was governed by the rise and fall of the water level in the loch. Cora's grandfather, Thomas Finch, had been a lock-keeper of the old school, a man who understood the intricate mechanics of the gates and paddles, not just as a job, but as a custodial duty. He spoke of the canal as a living thing, with moods and tempers that had to be respected. He had worked the loch for 20 years, and for 20 years, Rose had made their life in the small, 2-room cottage. She cultivated a garden that defied the damp, clay-heavy soil, coaxing roses and beans and potatoes from the narrow strip of land between the cottage wall and the towpath. When Thomas died suddenly, a heart attack on a frozen February morning while wrestling with an iced-up paddle gear, the British Waterways Board had assumed she would leave. A widow in her 40s, they reasoned, would want to move to a proper town, to a house with central heating and neighbors close by. But Rose had refused. The cottage was her home, the canal her community. She had fought with a quiet, unshakable tenacity to stay. She navigated the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the newly privatized water authorities, uncovering an obscure clause in an old charter that gave her a sitting tenant's right to purchase the property. It took her 3 years of letter writing and quiet persistence, but she bought the cottage and the small parcel of land it stood on. It was not an investment. For Rose, it was an act of preservation, of holding fast to the only world she knew. She had lived there for another 50 years, a constant, watchful presence, her life measured by the passage of the narrowboats and the turning of the seasons along the water. Cora's past was a map drawn along that towpath. Her earliest memories were of her grandmother's hands, strong, capable hands, the knuckles slightly swollen with arthritis, but endlessly patient. Hands that could coax a jam jar lid loose, gut a fish, or point out the iridescent flash of a kingfisher. Rose taught her the practical magic of the lock, how to wind the windlass to raise the heavy paddle, the precise moment to lean her small weight against the massive balance beam to swing the gate open, the importance of closing the downstream paddles before opening the upstream ones. It was a catechism of cause and effect, of patience and leverage. "Water has all the time in the world," Rose would say, her voice calm and steady as the canal itself. "You can't rush it, you just have to work with it." While other children learned multiplication tables, Cora learned the cubic tonnage of water it took to fill the lock chamber, the subtle shifts in current that signaled a coming rain, the names of the working boats that still carried coal and timber. She learned the particular quality of her own resilience, a quiet endurance that, like the canal, followed a steady course, unimpressed by storms or sudden floods. She met Elliot at a university function, a conference on urban water management. He was a postgraduate student in architecture and property development, and he was drawn to her deep practical knowledge. He was attentive in the specific way that lonely people find irresistible. He listened. He asked questions. He seemed fascinated by her world, by the technical language of flow rates and sediment transport she used so fluently. He was handsome, ambitious, and saw the world as a series of problems to be solved, of systems to be optimized. For a time, his certainty was a comfort. He planned their lives with the same meticulous detail he applied to a building schematic. He mapped out their careers, their finances, their future. Cora, who had always lived by the more organic, unpredictable rhythms of the natural world, allowed herself to be carried along by his confident current. But slowly she began to notice the transactional nature of his affection. He kept a mental ledger of favors given and received. He saw her expertise not as a part of her soul, but as a marketable skill, a unique asset. The relationship began to feel like one of his development projects. A foundation was laid, a structure was erected, but the interior remained unfurnished, cold, and echoing with unspoken absences. The moment he dismissed the canal cottage as a teardown, she understood the fundamental incompatibility of their worlds. He saw stone and timber as disposable commodities. She saw them as repositories of memory, of love, of a life lived with purpose. She knew then that she could never show him the cottage, because he was incapable of seeing it. He could only ever measure its worth, and in his measurement he would have found it wanting. The train journey from Birmingham to Worcestershire was a slow retreat from the hard geometric certainties of the city into the soft, winding contours of the countryside. With every mile, the concrete and glass gave way to hedgerows and rolling fields, the landscape of her childhood reasserting its claim on her. She carried a single suitcase filled with clothes and a few books, and her battered field bag, which contained not just her data logs, but the core of her professional identity. In her pocket was a debit card linked to her personal savings account, holding a meager £243, the sum total of her liquid assets. It was not enough. But as the train rattled over a viaduct, she looked down and saw the thin, silver ribbon of a canal cutting through the green valley below, and a feeling not of hope, but of simple, stubborn continuance took root in her. She was a Finch. She knew how to work with the current. The solicitor's office was in a small market town a few miles from the canal. It was a dusty, quiet place, smelling of old paper and furniture polish. Mr. Abernathy was a man in his late 60s with kind eyes and a gentle, deliberate manner. He had been her grandmother's solicitor for 30 years and had handled the probate of her will. He greeted Cora not as a client, but as the continuation of a long-held family acquaintance. He remembered her from when she was a girl, trailing after Rose with a jam jar for catching sticklebacks. He sat her down and made her a cup of strong, sweet tea. He didn't ask about Birmingham or the reason for her sudden arrival. He simply opened a large, stiff folder and began to speak. He confirmed that the cottage, the freehold of the land, and all its contents were legally and indisputably hers. The deeds were in her name, the council tax paid up for the year from the remainder of Rose's small estate. He spoke of her grandmother with a deep, quiet respect, praising her resilience, her common sense, her particular quality of unshakable integrity. She was a remarkable woman, he said, looking at Cora over the rim of his spectacles. She knew the value of things, the real value. Then he reached into a drawer and produced a single, heavy key. It was made of black iron, ornate and rusted in places, the bit worn smooth with a century of use. "This is the original lock-keeper's key," he explained. "Your grandmother insisted it stay with the property. She said it opened more than just the door." She walked the last 2 miles along the towpath. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. The canal was a sheet of hammered pewter under the gray sky. When the cottage came into view, nestled in a bend of the canal, it looked smaller and more vulnerable than she remembered. The garden was a riot of overgrown brambles and weeds, choking the life out of the hardy perennials Rose had planted. The paint on the window frames was peeling, and a few slates were missing from the roof, leaving dark, jagged gaps. But the structure itself stood firm. The thick, 19th-century stone walls were solid, settled deep into the earth, their surfaces covered in a tapestry of moss and lichen. The chimney was straight and tall. It had what her grandfather used to call good bones. It was a place built to endure. She stood for a long moment, just looking, the cold iron of the key a heavy, solid weight in her hand. This was not a ruin. This was a foundation. This was hers. The key turned in the lock with a loud, grating groan, the sound of long disuse. The door swung inward on a single, long sigh, releasing a wave of cold, still air. The inside of the cottage smelled of wood smoke, damp stone, and the faint, lingering scent of her grandmother's lavender soap. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light slanting through the grimy windows. Everything was as Rose had left it 2 years ago, covered now in a fine gray shroud. A kettle sat on the small stove. A stack of old boating magazines rested on a wooden chair. In the corner stood the lock-keeper's chest. It was a large, plain box made of dark, heavy wood, bound with iron straps. It was older than the cottage itself, a piece of canal history, passed down from one keeper to the next. Her grandmother had always been protective of it, telling Cora it held the history of the place. She had often told her with a knowing look to take good care of it. Now, Cora understood that it had been more than just a casual remark. It had been an instruction. She ran her hand over the rough, splintered wood of the chest. It felt solid, immovable. She lifted the heavy lid. Inside, it was mostly empty, containing only a few folded wool blankets, smelling of mothballs, and a small, leather-bound logbook filled with her grandfather's spidery handwriting, recording decades of canal traffic. She remembered Rose's words, her specific emphasis. Take care of it. She knelt and felt along the inside of the chest, her fingers searching for an anomaly, a seam, a joint that didn't belong. Near the back, her fingertips brushed against a slight unevenness in the wood. She pressed. A section of the back panel, no bigger than a book, clicked and pushed inward, revealing a dark, hollow space behind it. It was a cleverly made false back. the kind of secret compartment built by people who understood the need to keep things safe from prying eyes. Reaching into the cavity, her hand closed around a cold, hard object. It was a rectangular biscuit tin, its painted lid showing a faded picture of the royal family. The edges were sealed shut with a thick layer of hardened wax. She carried the tin to the small wooden table and used a knife from the kitchen drawer to carefully pry it open. The wax seal broke with a brittle crack. Inside, nestled in yellowed tissue paper, were 3 things. The first was a thick bundle of old 20-pound notes held together with a rubber band that had gone stiff with age. The second was a small, heavy canvas bag, which clinked when she picked it up. She loosened the drawstring and poured the contents onto the table. A cascade of gold sovereigns tumbled out, shining with a dull, heavy luster in the dim light. They were old and worn, bearing the profiles of forgotten kings and a long-dead queen. She counted the money slowly, methodically. The cash amounted to 10,000 pounds. The sovereigns, she estimated, were worth at least twice that. It was a small fortune, saved over a lifetime of frugality and quiet foresight. It was enough. It was enough to begin again. The third item in the tin was a letter. It was a single sheet of thick, cream-colored paper, yellowed at the edges, folded in 4. The letterhead was from the old British Waterways Board, paper her grandfather must have brought home from his office. The handwriting was her grandmother's, a familiar, elegant script that was both firm and graceful. She unfolded it, her hands trembling slightly. It was dated a month before her death. "My dearest Cora," it began. "If you are reading this, then you have found your way home, and you are in need of it. I hoped you would not need it so soon, but I have learned that life rarely follows the plans we make for it. This cottage is yours now. It is more than stone and slate. It is a place of refuge. It has kept our family safe through hard times, and it will do the same for you. The money is for the practical things. It is for the roof and the windows and for food in the larder. Do not be afraid to spend it. Money is a tool, nothing more. Its only purpose is to allow you to live with dignity. The roofer in the village is named Davies, but everyone calls him Sari. His father worked on this roof with your grandfather. He is an honest man. Tell him you are Rose Finch's granddaughter, and he will treat you fairly. But the most important thing I leave you is not the money or even the cottage itself. It is the knowledge that you come from a long line of people who know how to endure. We are not a grand family, but we are a strong one. We understand the value of patience, of hard work, and of knowing your own mind. There will be people in your life who measure everything in pounds and pence, who cannot see the worth in something old or quiet or slow. Do not let them make you doubt yourself. They can count money, but they can't count this. They cannot count the feeling of the sun on your face as you sit by the water. They cannot count the peace that comes from a day of honest labor. This is a different kind of wealth, Cora. It is the kind that no one can ever take from you. It is in your blood and in your bones. Now make yourself a cup of tea, put a log on the fire, and begin. With all my love, your grandmother, Rose. Cora sat at the dusty table, the letter in her hand and the gold coins gleaming beside it. And she wept. She wept for her grandmother, for the loss of her love and her quiet wisdom. She wept for the life she had lost in Birmingham, not for Elliot, but for the naive belief that his structured, ambitious world could ever have been a home for her. And she wept with a profound, aching sense of relief, the feeling of a ship that has been tossed in a violent storm, finally reaching a calm, safe harbor. The letter was more than a comfort. It was a validation. It was her grandmother's voice, reaching across time, reminding her of who she was. She was a Finch. She knew how to endure. She wiped her eyes, folded the letter carefully, and put the kettle on the stove. The first task was the roof. Winter was approaching, and the gaps in the slate were a clear and present danger. She found Sari Davies's number in a local directory. When she called and introduced herself as Rose Finch's granddaughter, there was a warm recognition in his voice. He came by the next day, a tall, wiry man with hands as tough as old leather and a gentle Welsh accent. He surveyed the roof with a practiced eye, pointing out not just the missing slates, but the rotting laths beneath them. He gave her a quote that was, she knew, remarkably fair. "Your grandmother was a good woman," he said, looking not at the roof but at Cora. "She gave my father work when things were tight after the mines closed. It's the least I can do." He offered not just to do the work, but to teach her. "No sense paying me for labor you can do yourself," he said. "You've got the look of someone who isn't afraid of hard work." And so her rebuilding began. Sari showed her how to use a slate ripper to remove the broken pieces, how to measure and cut the new Welsh slates, how to nail them in place in overlapping rows, ensuring a watertight seal. The work was physically demanding, her muscles aching at the end of each day. But there was a deep satisfaction in it, a rhythm that cleared her mind. The repetitive clink of the hammer, the scrape of the slate cutter, the view from the rooftop over the tranquil canal, it all became a form of moving meditation. She learned the specific vocabulary of the craft, the difference between an eave and a ridge, a valley and a hip. As she worked alongside Sari, he told her stories about her grandfather, about the legendary winter of 1963, when the canal froze solid and he had helped to break the ice for the coal boats. She was not just repairing a roof, she was weaving herself back into the fabric of her family's history, one slate at a time. With the roof secure, she turned her attention to the walls. The old lime mortar was crumbling in places, leaving gaps between the stones that invited damp and drafts. Sari had taught her the basics of repointing, explaining the importance of using a traditional lime-based mortar that would allow the old stone walls to breathe, unlike modern cement, which would trap moisture and cause the stone to decay. He left her with his tools and a recipe for the mortar mix. The process was slow, methodical, and deeply rewarding. She spent weeks chipping out the old, failed mortar with a hammer and chisel, her hands raw and calloused. Then she learned to mix the new mortar, lime putty, sharp sand, and water to the perfect consistency, like thick cream. Pressing it into the joints with a trowel, smoothing it down and brushing the excess away was a painstaking process. But as she worked her way around the cottage, section by section, she felt a profound connection to the building. She was not just patching its wounds, she was strengthening its core. Her own sense of fragmentation began to recede, replaced by a feeling of wholeness, of being solidly put together. Inside, the work of personalization was a gentler, more intimate process. She scrubbed the cottage from top to bottom, washing away the years of dust and neglect. She sanded the wide, dark floorboards by hand until the beautiful grain of the old pine shone through, then sealed them with beeswax and turpentine, filling the small space with a clean, resinous scent. The walls she painted a warm, creamy white, which reflected the light from the small windows and made the rooms feel larger and brighter. She took apart the old sash windows, carefully scraping away decades of accumulated paint, replacing the cracked panes and oiling the ancient pulley mechanisms until they slid up and down with a smooth, satisfying weight. She painted the frames and the front door a traditional canal art green, a vibrant, living color that stood out against the gray stone. She bought simple, second-hand furniture, a sturdy wooden table, a comfortable armchair, a single bed, and arranged the space for her new, solitary life. In one corner, she set up a drafting table, creating a small, efficient workspace where she could unroll her maps and analyze her hydrological data. The cottage was no longer just her grandmother's house, it was becoming her own. As the physical structure of her life became more secure, she knew she needed to find work. The money from the tin was a buffer, a gift that had allowed her to begin, but it was not infinite. She saw a posting for a contract position with the local branch of the Environment Agency, a 6-month project surveying the network of tributary rivers that fed the canal. It was her exact field of expertise. She applied, sending in a CV that detailed her university qualifications and her recent freelance work. She was granted an interview. The regional supervisor was a man named David Chen. He looked at her CV, then looked at her address at the top of the page. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. "Finch," he said, more to himself than to her. "From the old Lock Cottage. Are you any relation to Rose Finch?" When Cora confirmed she was her granddaughter, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. "I knew your grandmother," he said. "Met her a few times when I was doing field work out here years ago. She knew more about the water levels in this district than all our telemetry put together. She once pointed out a blocked culvert half a mile upstream just by looking at the color of the water in the lock. Saved us a week of searching. That kind of knowledge. You can't learn that." The rest of the interview was less a formal questioning and more a conversation between two professionals who shared a deep respect for the same subject. He was impressed not just by her academic qualifications, but by the intimate, almost intuitive understanding of the local waterways that she had inherited. She was offered the job on the spot. Her new life settled into a quiet, satisfying rhythm. 3 days a week, she was out in the field for the agency, wading in streams, taking measurements, her work a seamless extension of who she had always been. The other days were for the cottage and the canal. On her days off, she began a personal project. Using her own equipment, she started to create a detailed hydrological and ecological map of her small stretch of the canal. She documented the flow rates through the lock, the patterns of sediment, the colonies of water voles, the nesting sites of the moorhens. It was a project that merged her scientific training with her inherited legacy, a way of honoring both her profession and her grandmother's deep connection to this specific place. She was creating her own logbook, a modern companion to her grandfather's handwritten records in the old chest. It was work that felt deeply meaningful, a quiet act of stewardship. As spring arrived, turning the towpath into a corridor of lush green and wildflowers, the community of the canal began to re-embrace her. Boaters who had known Rose for decades would moor up by the lock and stop by for a chat. They brought her bags of vegetables from their small gardens, shared stories of her grandmother, and praised the work she was doing on the cottage. An elderly man who had been the lock keeper before her grandfather brought her a collection of old photographs of the cottage from the 1950s. A local artist asked if she could sit on the towpath and sketch the restored stonework. The new lock keeper, a young man named Sam, often stopped by for a cup of tea, asking her advice on the temperamental nature of the old paddle gear, respecting her knowledge as if she had been working the lock her whole life. She was no longer just an inhabitant of the cottage. She was becoming a part of the canal's living memory, a quiet, watchful presence, just as her grandmother had been. Cora from the Finch cottage. She was home. It was on a bright, clear morning in late April that Elliot arrived. The air was full of the scent of damp earth and blooming blackthorn, and the sun cast a warm, benevolent light on the cottage. Cora was outside, on her knees on the damp ground, repointing the last section of the low stone wall that bordered the garden. Her hands were covered in the pale gray of the lime mortar, her face smudged with it. She was absorbed in her work, in the simple, satisfying task of pressing the mortar into the joints when the crunch of unfamiliar footsteps on the gravel towpath made her look up. He stood there, about 20 feet away, looking utterly alien in this landscape. He was wearing an expensive dark wool overcoat, sharply tailored trousers, and polished leather city shoes that were already collecting a film of towpath dust. He looked like a glossy magazine advertisement that had been accidentally pasted into a watercolor painting. He was staring at the cottage, his expression a mixture of disbelief and bewilderment. He took in the solid roof, the freshly painted windows, The wisp of smoke curling from the chimney, the neat rows of spring vegetables beginning to show in the garden. His eyes moved from the restored cottage to her, kneeling on the ground in her old work clothes, a trowel in her hand. For a moment, he seemed unable to reconcile the two images. This was not the displaced, disempowered woman he had left with her equipment on a city doorstep. This was someone else entirely, someone grounded, competent, and utterly self-contained. He had come, she sensed, expecting to find her struggling, perhaps hoping to offer some kind of magnanimous, condescending assistance. What he found instead was a life rebuilt, a world remade without him. "To, Cora," he said, his voice uncertain. She did not stand up. She did not stop her work. She picked up another scoop of mortar on her trowel and pressed it firmly into a gap between two stones. She smoothed it with a practiced motion before she finally turned her head to look at him. "Elliot," she said. Her voice was calm, even, devoid of any anger or surprise. It was the voice of someone addressing a stranger who had asked for directions. He took a hesitant step closer, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the soft earth. "I didn't know," he said, gesturing vaguely at the cottage. "I had no idea this was here. I did a search of your assets. This never came up." The words hung in the clean morning air, a perfect distillation of his worldview. He had searched her assets. He had calculated her worth. "I thought I was thorough," he added, and it was a confession, an admission that his cold, hard accounting had failed him, that there were columns in the ledger he had not even known existed. Cora finally laid her trowel down on a clean stone and slowly rose to her feet, wiping her hands on a cloth tucked into her belt. She looked at him, at his expensive coat and his bewildered expression, and she felt a profound and quiet sense of clarity. There was no bitterness left, only a vast, calm distance between them. "In the 5 years we were together," she said, her voice still quiet, but carrying a weight of irrefutable truth, "you never once asked me about my grandmother. You never asked where she lived or what her home was like. You never asked about this part of my life." He had no answer to that. It was a simple statement of fact, and its implications were devastating. He had only ever seen the parts of her that he considered assets, her professional skills, her intelligence, her presence at his side at corporate events. The deeper, quieter parts of her, the parts connected to this place, to her family, to the slow-moving water, he had never even bothered to look for. He looked from her to the cottage and back again, a dawning awareness in his eyes, a flicker of understanding of the magnitude of what he had overlooked. "Cora," he began, taking another step forward. I made a mistake." He paused, searching for the right words, the right formula to fix this unexpected problem. "Is there anything that can be repaired between us?" The question was vague, a developer's inquiry into the structural integrity of a ruined relationship. She looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, she saw him clearly, not as the man who had broken her heart, but as a man with a profound and crippling poverty of imagination. He could build houses, but he could not comprehend the meaning of a home. She felt a brief, fleeting pang of pity for him. Then it was gone. She shook her head, a small, final gesture. "No," she said. The word was not harsh, not angry. It was simply a statement of fact, as clear and solid as the stone wall at her back. "No, there isn't." He seemed to shrink slightly. He looked down at his dusty, inappropriate shoes, then back at her calm, resolute face. He accepted it. There was no argument to be made, no negotiation to be had. He had come with nothing to offer that had any value here. He nodded once, a clipped, defeated gesture, then turned and walked away, his footsteps receding down the towpath until they were gone. That evening, Cora did not go back inside the cottage. Instead, she walked to the edge of the lock and sat on the massive wooden balance beam, her feet dangling above the dark, still water. The air grew cool as the sun began to set, painting the western sky in hues of soft pink and pale orange. The light caught the surface of the canal, turning it into a shimmering path of liquid gold. She watched as the last narrowboat of the day approached, its single headlight cutting a bright path through the deepening twilight. She stood and walked to the gearing, inserting the windlass and beginning the familiar, rhythmic work of opening the sluices. The water churned and gurgled as it filled the lock chamber, lifting the boat slowly and steadily. She leaned against the balance beam, opening the heavy gate, and watched as the boat chugged out into the canal beyond, its occupants waving a silent thank you. She stood by the lock for a long time, listening to the water settle, to the quiet sounds of the evening. She thought about the generations of her family who had stood on this very spot, performing these same tasks, their lives intertwined with the slow, patient rhythm of the canal. She thought of her grandmother, Rose, and the incredible, quiet strength she had possessed, a resilience born from a deep understanding of what truly mattered. And she thought of Elliot, a man who moved through the world with such confidence, yet was blind to its most essential truths. He had a builder's eye but could not see the strength in old stone. He was a master of spreadsheets but could not calculate the value of a legacy. He saw a world of assets to be acquired, leveraged, and disposed of. He would never understand a world based on stewardship, on patience, on the quiet, unpaid work of tending to a place until it became a part of you. His world was transactional, hers was generational. Elliot had taken everything he could count. He had taken the balance in the bank account, the square footage of the flat, the catalogued value of their furniture and art. He had stripped her life down to what could be quantified and documented, and he had taken it all. But in his meticulous, cold accounting, he had left behind the only thing that mattered. He forgot the old stone cottage her grandmother left. It was the best thing he ever forgot.